Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Well, welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast. I'm here today with Daniel Kwak. Daniel, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Daniel and his brother Sam are known fondly as the Kwak Brothers. You can follow them, thekwakbrothers.com. Easy to follow. They're involved in real estate. They're mentors. I have a great YouTube channel. I have lots of people that they talk to. They're authors. And so, Daniel, great to spend some time with you today, and I look forward to exploring some concepts.
Yeah, no, it's an honor to be here. I loved your book, Kingdom Economics. I know we talked a lot about that off the camera, and I've heard you speak at a couple of events. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you today on whatever God has for us.
Yeah, great. Well, Daniel, there's a lot of interviews with you where people go into your whole background, so we won't spend a ton of time on that. But I know you came here with your parents as immigrants in 1999, and I beat you by about 13 years, just to let you know.
Nice.
But I think it's the last time I beat you at anything, because you and Sam have done really well. And so I figured you must have been trust fund babies born with a lot of money. Is that the story?
Yeah. Well, sure, I guess, but trust fund meaning that they trusted me a lot, right? There was no money necessarily in a trust fund, so to speak. But no, so we had one of those, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can understand the life of an immigrant, right? We had one of those apartments where you flicker the light on and the cockroaches kind of all escape to the outsides of the room, and so it was a tiny, tiny apartment. I think it was, maybe 600 square feet or something like that. And, my parents, their bedroom tripled as our dining room and also our kitchen. And I think to some degree our living room as well. So we were definitely not trust fund babies. No spoon in my mouth growing up.
Right. Yeah. But it was amazing. So your parents were people of faith, your dad was a pastor, and at some point you figured out, well, I have to take these principles of faith that work for my spiritual life, and I have to figure out a connection to my everyday economic life. And that's just an amazing journey, right?
Yeah. And, it's good. I always tell people I grew up with the advantage of being poor. Yeah. Like a lot of individuals say, well, he grew up privileged or she grew up privileged. And oftentimes that implies that, they grew up with family that had a lot of resources. My philosophy is, look, everybody grows up privileged, but it's just a matter of privileged with what? Yeah. Some people are privileged with finances, with resources, and that's great, right? However, I grew up with privilege as well, but I had the privilege of not having resources so that my resourcefulness can really grow, expand, and be there by the time I was 18, 19, 20 years old, starting my business.
Fantastic. So you learn to work, you learn to figure things out, and got going with the business. So from what I understand, you and your brother had did you have a mobile DJ business? Is that what
That's right.
Had? So yeah, were you like a K-pop Korean rapper?
No, thankfully, no. Thankfully I am not anywhere near K-pop, right? It's those guys, they wear makeup and they dance on stage, and it's just like completely demasculates the Korean man. And, but good for them. I'm sure they're doing really well. And, but no, so, great memory, by the way, Brett. My brother and I, indeed, our very first business was a DJ company. So my brother started the business first. Yeah. And, I always tell people my brother is a much better entrepreneur than I am. His ability to just go and take risks and just run at something 110%. Yeah. For me, I'm a little different, right? I have to take a little bit more time to make sure, okay, am I going in the right direction? Are things right? But he started a DJ company when he was 18 and I was 17. So I was still in high school. And, I was working a tutoring job at the time. And he threw this one event that unfortunately didn't go so well. Yeah. And, he was kind of, negative on some funds and had owed people some money. So because I was working a tutoring job and my natural propensities, I'm a saver. I love saving as much money as I can. And so I kind of, I did the thing that the U.S. government does a lot, which is bail them out, right? So I bailed out my brother, and I said the only exchange that I want is, let me help you, right? Let me help you out so that hopefully you're never in this type of situation ever again. Which once I got into business, I started realizing I actually really like this. Because it was a DJ company, but as I learned throughout the years, and as I learned today, whether it's a DJ company, whether you're mowing grass, whether you're selling widgets, every business is a people business. And that's what I've learned. And so I guess you could say the rest is history.
Well, you're taking me back in my years when my kids were teenagers, and I remember one of them was managing a band. I remember that story. And then going around and also doing events for young people and various things like it. So, but today there seems to me, from my perspective, Daniel, almost an attack on work. Like, work is bad. I know we've seen the quiet quitting, the great resignation. Numbers I saw last year was at 47 million people had quit their jobs. It's not a uniquely US phenomenon, but it seems like the value of work is being undermined. Partly, it's like a quick drug when the government gives you money for free for whatever reason. Hard to come off that one. Now, what's your view on socialism versus capitalism? Which do you prefer? What do you see now? What do you see right now in the marketplace? And I understand your preference, but for somebody that's in your shoes,
Well, I'm 29 years old. I'm an entrepreneur, and I like to believe that I'm very much in touch with my generation and the generation that's younger than mine. I prefer capitalism, and I'll tell you why, because based on what I see, right? Let's ignore the fact that it's also biblical, right? Like, socialism is very anti-biblical, but the worst thing that anyone can say about capitalism is, oh, well, there's corruption, there's greed, right? And greed certainly is a big thing, right? Where a lot of people and a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people choose profits over people. And, obviously that's bad. We can't have that. The teachings of Jesus very much implied that, where your money is, your heart is also. And there's been many times where Jesus, says like, hey, I'm here for the poor. I'm here to represent, woe to you, those that are rich, right? Or you will be humbled, and all these different things. But then you look at socialism and communism, and really the core of what those two things are is, let's call it what it is. It's Maoism, right? And you look at the negatives and the worst case that can happen with those type of things, and I think hundreds of millions of people dead in genocide later, you can kind of come to the conclusion that, I think having a scenario in a system where there's an overrun of greed and corruption sometimes is better than the deaths of 100 million people. So I think my generation, just by default, we've been so far removed from a time where the consequences of such things are not as present. Like, I think back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the consequences of communism and socialism was so apparent. It was so clear that people were willing to volunteer, sign up, join an army, and risk their lives to ensure that those type of ideologies never reach the front doors of their family. So my generation, we grew up in the 90s, 2000s, and let's just be very honest, we grew up during a time where things were great. Everybody had a house, cars, right? And if you compare that to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, we're living better than any other human has in the history of mankind. And a lot of times when you grow up in the mountaintop, you forget. And my generation has grown up in the mountaintop, and unfortunately, we believe that there's something higher when I don't know if there is.
Right. So first world problems, as you say. I dropped my MacBook on my other MacBook, but there are people with really big issues. It's unfortunate, because I know when I wrote the book Repurposing Capital, and I looked at what is capitalism. And is capital good or bad? Unfortunately, it's being equated with greed. And in scripture, when it talks about mammon, it means greed deified, making a god out of greed. And that has happened in our culture with consumerism. But unfortunately, companies or business can get painted with the same brush and say, well, they must be motivated by greed, whereas a business can be motivated by love, wanting to serve, wanting to find a good vehicle to serve as many people as possible, versus the wealth redistribution process. I have a lot of trees in my garden out here, and I've noticed that creepers grow up these trees, and they can look great, but they suck the life out of the trees. Eventually, the tree collapses, and it's almost like capitalism is like a tree, and socialism is the thing that lives off the tree, and it looks okay for a while, but it actually doesn't add much value, really. And yet I think there's a lot of it in the marketplace today. So yeah, good to get your thoughts on that, right?
Yeah, and kind of like you said, you touched on it a little bit, and I love to hear your perspective and you kind of expand on it. But I think capitalism is a great thing because it does reward the right things. It rewards problem solving. It rewards value creation. It rewards hard work and consistency. I think many people are very quick to tax the multimillionaire who spent a lot of money pouring money into the business to make it happen. But we're also, disregarding the 98% of individuals who started the business and failed and lost a lot of money, right? Yeah. We never really talk about those guys, but we always talk about, well, what about that one person that, did this and did that, And I think the happy middle, as I've kind of discovered, is, yes, capitalism, yes, strive and persist and whatnot, but also, what does it look like to be an entrepreneur and a leader that shares the heart of God?
Yeah.
What does it look like to be, a leader that sees what God sees, that has concerns for what God has concerns about, that celebrates that things that God celebrates, and most importantly, is heartbroken at the things that that breaks God's heart.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective as well. What have you learned about a lot of the things that we've just been discussing for the last 5 minutes?
Daniel, one of the things that has struck me in dealing with business leaders is if they can get, to your point, God's heart, then a lot of things change. The question is, God's heart for what? And we often think of, the poor or the needy and so on. But actually, a business is, to me, like a household. In fact, there's two Italian words, com and pun, those who gather around bread, company. That's where we get the word company. Yeah, and so a business is like a household. And, what do you do with your household? Well, you provide for the people that are in your family, work opportunities, business opportunities, but it's not just biological, it's your customers. How many customers do you have? Your suppliers, people who are providing you with raw materials or with services, your bankers, your lawyers, your auditors. So the concept of household is really, really powerful. And it's one that's mentioned in scripture, from what I see, 162 times. And we've lost the concept. What happened with the Reformation, there was such an emphasis on you've got to have an individual relationship with Jesus that we lost the concept of household. And yet for the first 1,000 years of the growth of the church, it was a B2B business. It was a B2B transaction, a household to household. Where this head of household reached that head of household, it was a family affair. It wasn't single file type of situation. And I think if we can recapture that in business, if you can say, man, I've met businesses, small businesses, who have 8 employees, but they have, thousands of customers. And so their sphere of influence is huge. And so the opportunity to serve tons of people through a self-sustaining business model is a huge opportunity. And if the focus is on how do I serve others, and that happens when people, I think, grasp the concept that this isn't just a place where I go to work. This is a network of relationships that's been entrusted to me. And I have those relationships by offering my goods, my services, by selling something, by serving people, by giving them an opportunity to buy and so forth. Yeah, so I think I've seen that change a lot of, it also frees business people up, because prior to that, I've seen business people who like, oh yeah, well, I go to church on a Sunday, I'm a little bit bored, but I go, I really like it, and I go, but I don't see the connection to Monday. And I love my business. I enjoy doing business. I enjoy buying and selling, doing whatever I'm doing, but they haven't made the connection that they can use their business processes to disciple people, whether those people know God or not. That's the issue. And so,
yeah. There's something I heard from a mentor of mine recently, and he's a big Christian business guy, and has been following Jesus with a lot of intention for many years. And he said something to me that really stuck out. And, he says, whether it's clients, whether it's your employees, like God is pursuing every single one of those people.
Yeah.
And the challenge that he issued out to me was, what would it look like for you as the CEO, as a leader, to not only be aware of that, but then ask God to join him in pursuing those people, whether it be clients, whether it be employees, whether it be whatever it be. But, I think that's kind of a little bit what Paul talks about, right? When he talks about the race, right? It's like those who want to win the race know the rules and know how to win. And, I love how he transitions that to, we as believers, we win the race. Our prize is an, eternal prize.
Right.
And, when I read that, one of the things that I hear from the Spirit in terms of the interpretation of that passage is those that are non-believers work for things that are temporary. They work for things that are not eternal. And let's call it what it is. Most entrepreneurs, especially with those that are non-believers, they work for the nicer car, right? They want the Porsche in the garage and the lake house and, the Hamptons and all the different things. But I think for guys like me and you, guys who just, we're doing our best to follow Jesus, I think the challenge for us looks a little different. What is the work that we do today? How do we follow the Spirit of the Lord every single day so that the work that we do is eternal? And it's, it lasts for a long time. And I think on top of that, it adds to how much more we have to be excellent at our craft and how much more we have to dedicate time towards being better leaders and better business people and, better podcast guests as well, because of the work that we do and how long it lasts compared to those that don't believe.
Yeah. So, Daniel, you've helped a lot of people through real estate investing to get financially secure. Do you still think real estate is a good thing? We're living in more and more digital world, a virtual world. People are talking about digital twin cities and so forth. And tell me about, do you still have a passion for real estate? Do you still see that as a good road to travel?
Yeah, if anything, I have more passion because, you and I are very aware of this and we talked about this a lot, but, whether it be governments, whether it be entities like the World Economic Forum or other individuals, they're really pushing for this concept of a centralized bank digital currency, a CBDC, so to speak.
Right.
And, if you really drill down to what it really is, it's a tool for, governments to be able to not only monitor, but control our finances.
Right.
And there's two sides of it, right? Where on one hand, Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. It talks about in Romans 15:16, right? Us as believers, we should be submissive to the authorities and government and pay our, fair share of taxes. Absolutely. And we do, right? Our organization, we do that. We absolutely pay our taxes. In fact, we love it so much that I live in the state of Illinois, right? Where our property taxes are the highest out of any other state in the country. And, our income, and we don't agree necessarily with where it goes, right? I think a lot of believers and a lot of libertarian, individuals would say, hey, I would feel so much better about paying taxes if it went to good places and if it was actually productive. I had somebody convict me the other day. I was like, well, guess what? When Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, what do you think the Roman Empire was doing with all those funds?
Right. Yeah.
They weren't doing the right things. If anything, those were times where they were actively promoting sexual immorality. There was mass corruption. There was significant amount of injustice. There was, if anything, more evil being done during those times and those authorities than today, right? I mean, even under certain administrations and political leaders. And so, I think the question that you ask is it's a very, very, very powerful thing, especially in a world that is going more digital. And, we seem to be losing more and more, autonomy with how we choose to invest and choose to put our money. I will say, I still think it's an amazing investment opportunity. Just off of the basis of, we saw what inflation's been doing over the last 3 to 5 years. And, real estate is a great asset that is able to hedge against it. I do think in a world where things are getting more digital, the tangible things will become more valuable. And on top of that, it's an asset that people have been investing into for thousands and tens of thousands of years. And I don't think it's ever going to go away.
Okay, great. Now, we're not going to get into a real estate investing class over here, but if people did want to learn more about that stuff, where could they go? And then we'll transition to some other topics, but just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we have a great website. So I love giving away things for free. I'm like online Oprah, man. Everyone gets a car. Everyone, you get a car and you get a car.
Yeah.
So I used to charge for my real estate investing course, but we actually decided to just put it out there for free.
Yeah.
And so, if you go to the kwakbrothers.com and, go on their free stuff, we do have a free real estate course that we give out. I think that course is about 30, 40 hours long. And there's all sorts of things on there on how to negotiate for creative financing. And, there's a productivity course in there. I believe there's a credit course in there as well. And so if people want to just go to the website, go to the kwakbrothers.com. We have a bunch of free resources. My book that I wrote, 0 to 75 units in 1 year. I outlined the exact step-by-step process on how I scaled my real estate investing portfolio. That's also free. All you have to do is just go to 0 to 75units.com and you'll find everything on those two sites.
Fantastic. And that's an amazing story, right? Because we didn't dig into it because it's well documented elsewhere. But I mean, just after some years of struggling, you finally came upon a system that you and Sam put together, and that really escalated things quickly. So just a great story worth checking out. And so, Ricky, I really recommend that. So let's go back and talk a little bit. You mentioned the World Economic Forum. So the now famous statement of Klaus Schwab, you will own nothing. By 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. What's that about? And and as a guy who owns a bit of real estate, what is the center? What's really driving that? And what is the World Economic Forum pushing for?
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of a bit of a backstory on how I fell upon this, right? And, when people hear about the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution and all these different things and shareholder economy, right? These are all words that they use. A lot of times, people often visualize the guy with the tinfoil hat in the basement of somewhere and going, the world's going to end. And, we all have to get our guns and fight back now. Right. But, about 4 years ago, I was just a guy on YouTube sharing real estate stuff. And, we would post videos about investing. And, at the time, our channel had, I think, about 150,000 subscribers. Today, we were at 320. Right. But back then, a couple of years back, 3 or 4 years ago, I was posting stuff about personal finance, right? We were talking about how to pay off your mortgage. We were talking about housing market. We were talking about credit cards to get and whatever. And we were a finance channel. And then one day, one of the guys that worked for us said, hey, I think you got to really talk about this Great Reset thing. And, it's kind of gnarly. And this is back in 2019, like before COVID happened. So when the pandemic happened, we were like, oh my gosh, like what's going on? So, when I learned more about it, at face value, it seems legitimate. At face value, it seems awesome, right? They're using words like diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? They're talking about essential, social governance and all the different stuff, right? Environmental, social governance, like they're saying all these great things. And then, you kind of learn about the real policies that they want to implement. Right. And from a 30,000-foot view, the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, what they're trying to push and really what their agenda is, it seems that they're using a lot of different topics like climate change, a lot of different topics like global economy, a lot of these things. And it just so happens that all the power, decision-making, and resources get centralized at the top with a lot of these global leaders. And then you kind of scratch your head as like, well, is there really any other way to solve these problems aside from you having all the money, the power, and the decision-making? And, they really kind of push it as the only way to do it. So from a long story standpoint, that's the agenda of what they're trying to do. Some of the details is they want the world to eat less meat. They want everything to move over to, non-organic, non-natural forms of farming and synthetic food. They want individuals to be vaxxed up and put even more chemicals in our body and whatnot. And, these are things that I just personally don't agree with.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the centralized control. So as you look at what the World Economic Forum is doing, I mean, if you're going to own nothing, I'm going to own nothing. Somebody is still going to own something. And it gets owned by technocrats. These are people who sit behind desks, they're unelected officials, and they claim to know better on the assumption that they are smarter than the average man in the street. And so you've got 7 billion people who are not the brightest bulbs on the Christmas tree, but we are at the top of the Christmas tree and we know what's good for everybody. So give us all of your stuff and we'll redistribute it out. Now, early on, I asked you a question about socialism, capitalism. What do you like? And if you'd come from North Korea, you would have had a proper story to tell me instead of South Korea. But anyway, the point is actually there's some similarities in the roots, the centralized control, the redistribution of wealth, and a removal of freedom of individual choice. And one of the things that struck me looking at history is how out of the Reformation grew an economic boom. And I believe it's partly because if people figure out, like, if I can decide where I'm going to spend eternity, I can decide how I'm going to spend my money. I can decide what business I'm going to be in. I have a future. I have a hope. So I can co-create. I can work to make things because I'm made in the image of God. Versus I will be content consuming a reasonable amount, not living in excess, but I actually don't own anything. So it's very disempowering versus empowering. And, the responsibility sits with the individual, which it should biblically, versus sitting centrally. Yeah. So it's very interesting. And then, there are other even worse aspects to what goes on there in terms of views of children and national borders and trafficking and all sorts of things. But just sticking with the economic stuff for the moment, I do think, as I said earlier, that work is under attack, and we have to watch it very, very carefully when we say, "Oh yeah, I just don't want to work anymore. I would rather be given stuff." On the other hand, I see people have a passion for purpose. So there's got these two parallel things going. So people are saying, I want to do work on purpose. I don't want to just be a cog in the wheel. I don't want to just work for the machine. I want my work to have meaning. What are you seeing, Daniel, with your peers in your generation? I saw a study last week or recently about spirituality, that young people, they gung-ho about Jesus. They just don't like mega churches. Even local churches get a medium rating, but certainly mega churches, mega bands, Christian celebrities are like low on the totem pole of the things. So what are you seeing with your generation?
Yeah, and I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Because I do truly admire my generation's kind of craving for authenticity. Yeah. And, I think for a lot of younger Christians, especially my age, when they see the mega church, they see the Holy Spirit commercialized and almost industrialized. Yeah. I have a friend of mine who's a South Korean pastor who took a year to just go through different churches throughout the United States. And somebody asked him, what did you learn about the American church? And he says, it's amazing what the American church can do without the power of the Holy Spirit. And you listen to something like that and you're like, wow, but there is some level of truth to that, and I grew up 5 minutes from one of the largest churches in the United States, which is, Willow Creek. Right. Yeah. And, I grew up literally 5 minutes down the road from South Barrington, Illinois. I lived in Streamwood, which is the opposite of South Barrington. The houses are much smaller and they have gun holes in them. Right. But I do think that my generation does crave that form of authenticity and community, which makes sense because so many of us grew up with tablets and smartphones in our hands that we never really experienced the idea of sitting around the fire and sharing and sharing stories and, and allowing other people and relationships to be the solution to your boredom as opposed to YouTube. Right. So I do think that's amazing. On the other hand, where one of the things that you mentioned, my generation, the idea of work, I think there is a beautiful phrase that I've heard a lot of people from your generation, Brett, use over and over again that my generation don't really say. And it's just this idea of you got to pay your dues. And my generation believes, and especially younger Gen Z believe that, hey, I got my 4-year degree. I'm 23 years old. I should be making 6 figures. Yeah. Like I've met a lot of friends who are a lot like that. you know?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I don't agree with that sentiment. I do believe in the idea of you got to pay your dues, right?
Yeah.
My brother and I took a little bit of a different path where we risked a lot of things to get to where we are today.
Right.
Risks that my peers were not willing to take and sacrifices that my peers were not willing to make as well. But I love the story of David. And, I've been reading David for pretty intently. In fact, one of the things that I've heard from the Spirit and that my peers and even my wife have pointed out is how similar, when they read David, how similar I am wired to the character of David. And it's just amazing how, the purpose that God had for him ever since he was 13, 14 years old was to be the king, right? It was to be the king of Israel and to be one of the greatest kings of all time. But yet he first had to be a shepherd to learn how to then be a warrior, to then learn how to be a king. And he wouldn't have been an amazing king unless he had learned to actually follow God as a warrior. And he never would have learned to be a warrior and follow God as a warrior unless he learned how to be obedient and have boldness as a shepherd boy. And I think there's such beauty. Like if you read scripture, like any single individual that you read about, like literally there's verses that go and God anointed that person. And oh, by the way, that anointing didn't come to pass for like another 40 years, right? Like, I mean, even like looking at Abraham and you look at Moses, you look at all these different things. I mean, there's decades that were passed between the time where they were receiving the identity that God has given them and the purpose that God has given them before they actually did something. And what's amazing is the fruition of their obedience doesn't actually come true in reality and doesn't come to pass until they're dead. Right. God gives Abraham this vision of your children will be like the sands of the beach, right? Well, that didn't necessarily even happen until long after Abraham was gone. So I do think one of the things that my generation could learn from your generation is this idea of like, yes, like God does have a purpose for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean he wants you to do it now. It might mean that he wants you to first be a shepherd so that you can learn to be a warrior, so that way you can learn to be a king. And then not only be a king, but be a great king, a king that actually is humble and follows God the way that God wants us to.
Yeah. So there's almost a paradox. Your generation wants purpose, but they don't want to put in the time to hone the skills and the character and what's needed to walk into that purpose. They want stuff more instantly. We had an Uber driver when Lynn and I landed in Cape Town recently, and the guy was from somewhere up in Africa, and his kid has just graduated from college as an engineer. I said, well, where's he working? No, he's not working. I said, oh, so he can't find a job? No, he's had job offers, but he believes he's worth more. He should earn more.
Yeah.
And I mean, the guy's never got one paycheck yet, but he thinks he's undervalued,
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, there was a lovely system that the British had for many, many years, was a 7-year apprenticeship. So when you were 14 years old, you went and you would live with the blacksmith. You'd live in their home. And then, you would stoke the fire. You'd probably make him a cup of tea in the morning. You did whatever. And then after 7 years, when you got to be 21, you graduated out of the apprenticeship and you got a key. It was part of the thing. And then you could join one of the guilds, one of the companies in the UK. And so a 7-year apprenticeship, and they actually used a small book of biblical principles that the master was to teach the apprentice during that time. And it's a time-consuming process to do that. I think there's something lovely about that. Yeah. So I love the fact that your generation wants a purpose, wants to work on purpose, doesn't want to just settle. But we do have to watch out for disbelief that business is good. In other words, look, there's a lot to complain about with big pharma, big media, big government, big anything. Yes, there can be corruption with anything. But at the same time, we've got to be careful not to lose the value of creating things with God and the notion that God rewards work. Not everybody's going to be, 40 under 40 or 30 under 30 or whatever it might be. But just the notion of good, healthy work, I think, is a good thing. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of what's going to be happening with work now that we're going through a huge change. I don't know where this change is going to end up with, But if we look at the concepts of augmented reality, virtual reality, Web3, artificial intelligence, and does that take away people's hopefulness about work? My job's going to disappear? Or does that, this is awesome. I can do stuff in 10 minutes that used to take my dad 10 hours. Which way do you see it?
Yeah. The only thing I'll say about this is I imagine that they were having the exact same conversation 20, 30 years ago when the internet first came out, right? I'm sure they had the same thing, right? And usually the pattern, and I'm a big history geek. I was actually a history major in college, before I transitioned over to business. But one of the things I love about history is that history will tell you that, especially with stuff like this, whether it's things that change the way humans do things, whether it be internet or artificial intelligence, it usually takes about 5-10 years before people get used to it. And then things come out and people change. We adapt. I mean, think about the amount of jobs and opportunities that have come because of the internet. Like, imagine, like, did you ever imagine when you were my age, Brett, that there would be things called YouTubers, right? And social media influencer, right? Like you go to LA, you go to Los Angeles, you get in an Uber, you get out, you point at someone random in the street, like, hey, what's your job? It's like, oh, I'm an Instagram model. It's like, well, what does that even mean, right? Like, I had no idea that you could even be an Instagram whatever.
That's right.
Yeah. So I imagine in 20, 30 years from now, when my hair gets a little gray and, all of a sudden my back hurts a little bit more and, I wake up and maybe my body's a little bit more sore than what it used to be. I'm sure there will be individuals, occupations where has a lot of things to do with AI and that opportunity wasn't here beforehand, And so I think whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, well, I think if we look at something like the internet, was there a lot of bad things that came from it? Absolutely. Sure. Right. I mean, there's not to go down too much down the rabbit hole, but there's like, the dark web and the dark market, there's a dark everything. Right. And certainly there have been many crimes committed over the internet. However, there's also been a lot of good that's happened as well. A lot of good. And so I don't anticipate any different for AI or augmented reality by any means. But I got to ask, I'm sure for you, how does it feel having, because you've had life before the internet. I have not. The internet, I actually was born with the internet. I was born in 94.
On digital. Yeah.
That's right. I was born in 94. The internet was born in 94.
Yeah.
What is your take, Brett, on that things that are happening with AI and ChatGPT? I mean, I'm sure you got to have a different perspective than someone like me.
Yeah. Look, I agree. There's nothing new under the sun. We went through the first internet wave. We were in Silicon Valley at the time. At that time, I wrote a book with Gary Deschamps, which was called I Operations, the impact of the internet on operating models or how the internet can transform. And we studied the winners and losers. We studied 600 companies to sort which ones, and we looked at government, at media, at different sectors of society and business. And there's some patterns. Certainly you can see those patterns. And somebody contacted me recently during COVID actually and said, Brett, your book is more relevant now than it ever was. And it's because the patterns are the same, right? So then we went, and during Web 1, we actually held a conference in 1995, Christians and the internet. People are like, what's the internet? And we had to explain it. And then we told them one day missions would be done virtually like this, and people couldn't get it, some of them. But we're back to another huge number of opportunities. And I think that each of these waves creates a set of opportunities that weren't there before. So I understand that it's tough for your generation because it's not, you get out of college. If you're an accountant, you join one of the big 8 it used to be. Now it's the 4 or whatever. And then, you have a steady job. You're going to be there 10, 20, 30 years. You get married, you buy a house and so forth. On the other hand, I watched the other day, Lynn and I were watching The Agency. It's the Parisian real estate guys. Have you seen those guys? Mm-hmm. Yeah, anyway, so they get a phone call from some guy. He wants to meet them. And the guy comes, and he's an investor, a real estate investor. And they meet this guy. He's 23 years old, right? And he's made his money in crypto. And he's sitting there talking to the guy who's about 35, the realtor, and saying to the realtor, yeah, I want to buy the house, but I want to pay in crypto. You've got to be able to sell it to me in crypto. And you can see the realtor doesn't really know what he's talking about. Anyway, he finds a Belgian financier who's willing to sell him an apartment in Paris for $2.5 million, a 23-year-old guy, and he pays in crypto, right?
Wow.
And the guy's like, how long does this take? No, it
Yeah.
just takes that long, and so on. And so this is a new thing for him. Anyway, lo and behold, in the same episode, he hooks up with a guy in the US who's an influencer, and they do their first live feed, Facebook Live type of deal. The influencer gets his people on there, and they show them a 22 million euro apartment in Paris. Walk him around. The one brother's got the little gimbal, and the other one's talking, part in French, part in English. And then there's 2,500 people, there's 5,000 people, dun, 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 sold to a lady in New York, 22 million euros. She's never seen the place. The guy goes back to the office. He's like, this is crazy.
Yeah, that's nuts.
That's interesting. Yeah. So the possibilities for your generation are great. And for the future of work for everybody, I think that the possibilities are there. However, as you say, things can be used for good. They can be used for harm. And my belief is that we need to get in the game. Like years ago, I had people visit my office in Silicon Valley from a major Bible translation organization. And I asked how many languages still needed scripture. And they said, well, it takes 25 years per language. And I'm like, wow, can't we do it quicker than that? And that's where I think some of today's tools are going to be helpful in many things. You'll be able to speak in one language and be understood in many languages. Like there are tools for instant translation, for example. Access to job markets, being able to do your work in one country and sell it in another country. I think that there's many, many opportunities. And I think people still need the physical touch. I think they need to be around. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things I really concern myself with my generation and Gen Z is, I mean, the community aspect. Right? Like we have kids today and people my age, which blows my mind, by the way, because, my background, when I first started, I was in sales, right? I used to do door to door. I did, everything from cold calling, right? And all this stuff. And I'm very grateful of it because it really kind of thickened my skin. But we have, 28-year-olds, 25-year-olds nowadays that are so afraid to just pick up a phone and call someone that they much rather, like, so for example, I have a friend who's getting married, and both couples are just terrified of calling someone, which in my opinion is so simple, but they're trying to plan their whole wedding just through emails and texting. Yeah. And I'm just, I'm like, my wife and I are like, you guys are going to have such a tough time just because they're so afraid to talk. And, maybe it's afraid of confrontation, right? Maybe it's, it blows my mind, but I think that's going to be such a big problem. And, if there's anything that I believe is the largest problem that the world have, it's not taxation, it's not corruption, it's not anything, it's not really any ideology, it's division, as Jesus says in scripture. And well, how do you have unity when you have an entire generation that doesn't know how to have healthy conflict? That's a big problem.
Maybe we'll have a conflict resolution bot that's created by AI and it'll solve
that's right.
So Daniel, as we head towards a close of here, and I don't want to rush this, so I want to give you time to chat about this. I do see the possibilities for your generation, but I also feel for them in terms of some of the challenges. I feel for the men, just the challenges in being men, the women, being women, the comparison. There's so much to compare yourself with in terms of people who are better at doing Instagram accounts than you are and looking like they've got a better life. There's, the job uncertainties. There's all sorts of things. What do you say to fellow millennials, for example, who are a bit disenchanted with society, where it's going, and consequently feel a bit hopeless? What's your hope for your generation?
Yeah, we live in a very interesting time, don't we? Even when I was younger, when I was 17, 18, or whenever I was 13, 14 years old, this is how recent all this stuff is. I never would have imagined that we'd had a day where you see the pride flag hanging on the White House. And that's happening right now. I mean,
Yeah.
they literally put the pride flag up, with the trans logo and all this stuff, right? And it's hanging literally in the middle of the White House. And the American flag is to the right and the American flag is to the left. And, technically speaking, that's a violation of the flag code here in the United States, but hey, so be it, right? And I never would have thought that would happen. So I think a lot of people and a lot of emotions are popping up because of how quickly a lot of this stuff is happening. And, I love talking to individuals that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s and just asking on what was the world like when you were my age, which is 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it's amazing how even for them, this is new territory. A lot of this stuff with, Black Lives Matter and wokeism and the LGBTQ plus, I don't know how many letters there are anymore, movement. And I think a lot of people are just so emotionally caught up in how quickly culture has changed from a social standpoint. I don't remember this stuff happening in college. I don't remember, if even just 5-6 years ago, I don't remember this at all.
Yeah.
And so I worry from a standpoint of, I worry, but I'm also optimistic. I worry from a standpoint of society has never seen the true consequences of going down these roads, of allowing men to compete in women's sports. And funny enough, how it's never the other way around, of allowing 7-year-old, 8-year-old kids to have hormone replacement therapy, to have gender affirming therapy and surgeries and procedures that are some irreversible and extremely harmful. We've never seen the consequences of that. And, you study history enough to know that a lot of times those are the origins of a downfall, an empire of some sorts. And so I don't know. I think my generation, unfortunately, is center stage of all this stuff that's happening. But I'm hoping we recognize the consequence of a lot of these things soon. And, we recognize the truth.
Yeah. It's very interesting. This morning I was just reading, and I have been reading the same little passage for the past 3-4 days. It's just after Jesus has been on the Mount of Transfiguration and he's met with Elijah and Moses, and he comes down, and they're coming down, and his followers say to him, look, some people say, doesn't Elijah have to come before the Messiah comes? And that's what they say. And Jesus has an interesting thing. He says, they're right when they say this, but I say this. And because they've got half the picture, basically, they now do whatever they like. They persecuted John the Baptist, who was the Elijah that really did come, and they're going to do it to me. And it's descriptive of our generation, where we grab a half a truth. God is loving. That's true. But it's only part of the truth. It's not all of the truth. And then we draw a false conclusion from a half truth. And I think we're sitting with that in some of the earlier stuff you mentioned. ESG, for example. Yes, we need to care for the environment, but where it's taken, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nothing is more diverse than every type, tribe, every tongue, every nation. Nothing is more inclusive than the actual truth of the gospel. I'm not talking about the institutional church. I'm not talking about the way people have messed it up. But the absence of kingdom people living it out in a real way has created space for other things. That's one of the reasons. But it's also just because there is good and evil in the world. And I think we are seeing it in stark relief at the moment. But we have to watch out for the evil being dressed up as half-truths and buying the half-truths. Even as people of God, we just have to be alert. Otherwise, we're going to get a half a truth. And we can do this within the church. I mean, we can have our own little versions of half-truths that exclude other people, that make us right and them wrong. So, I think it's a very critical time when we have to really, really look at truth as a whole, and what's the impact of truth on a whole, as a whole. So let me ask you: would you rather be alive today with the opportunities that the Kwak brothers have today, or how do you compare to where your parents were when they were your age?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of our companies are digital, so I don't know how that would have translated 30, 40, 50 years ago. I think my brother and I, we would have found something to make it work. I'm sure back then we would have started a shoe business or something, right?
Yeah.
People translate throughout different eras. It's like when you get into sports debates, right? When people say, "Oh, could Michael Jordan play in today's era?" Right? Like, could LeBron James been this good back in the 80s and 90s when all the hand checking and all different things, right? But I don't know. I think there's a reason why I grew up, and was born in the age that I was born in. Oftentimes the brightest candles must go to the darkest places, and I love what you said about the half truths, because man, that's certainly infiltrating our church and our society today, right? Where people do say God is loving, and that is true, but then do you love God to then obey what He says in His Word?
Right.
Like that's the other half, almost, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. I don't know how to answer it. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so let me go back full circle to the real estate side. And I'm going to give you a scenario. You're 29 now, but let's fast forward. Let's make you 34 years old or 35 years old. You live in an expensive city. Let's make it Los Angeles, because they've got good weather. All right. And you don't own your own house. You work in an industry where you don't have permanent employment because you're doing contract jobs. Say you're in the media industry, or you're doing something else, and so it's not like you have a full-time job doing Uber. How do you buy your first piece of real estate?
Perfect. Yeah. So I always say, depends on what your goal is. So if your goal is to eventually have a rental portfolio, and have a lot of doors and whatnot, there's this great concept called house hacking, where you buy a 3-unit or 4-unit, you live in one, you rent out the other. I always say, if you're renting currently and you're for sure that the rental portfolio is your goal, that is a great place to start. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. For me, I've rented before, I've owned before, so I've actually kind of gone back and forth. So about 7 years ago, I bought a house on a golf course, right? Because thankfully we found a lot of success early on in our companies, and so we bought a house on a golf course. That was great. And then once I got married, we moved to an apartment. We rented. I liked that actually even better. And now my wife and I, we bought a little townhome, and we like that as well. And so for me, I think I'm probably the last guy to ask that question, because I know a lot of guys. I have a buddy of mine. He's very, very well known in the online space. And his mantra is always, you're an idiot if you own a home. You should always be renting, but own what you could rent out, own the assets, but control where you live, right? And like that's kind of his mantra. And he's a very successful real estate investor. With I think they're up to 3 billion in assets under management. Wow. But I also have a lot of friends who are like, well, who are also successful. Like, well, you should own your home. Why not? Why throw away the equity, right? Why do that? So, I think there's a lot of contingencies and details. My wife and I, we've made the decision when we bought our townhome that we want to stay here for a long time, that we want to stay in the state of Illinois. But, if you are that guy in Los Angeles, you have contract work and, it's tough, I would definitely encourage to find creative ways to buy that piece of real estate. Whether it's to have the seller carry that note for you, which there are benefits, financial benefits to the seller, such as, tax deference. You make money as the bank through interest payments. And if you already have a lot of liquidity, that's great as well. There's a lot of other things you can go look at auctions. You could look at separate inventory. You can go off of wholesalers, right? I mean, there's so many creative ways to buy, especially a single family home, other than just needing to go to a bank and submit pay stubs and the solid W-2.
Yeah. So Daniel, one of the reasons why you agreed to do this podcast is because I gather you like hanging out with old people. That's the story, really, right? And you've used this to your advantage in the real estate space, right? So you've got to know the old dude that's 75 and a half in the shade. He's got 30 apartments. He's getting tired of changing the plumbing and chasing the tenants. They might even be rent control or something, but he's ready for something different. Maybe his wife's telling him to retire. And you've built relationships with people like that, right? I'm suspecting why you're on the podcast now, of course. But
well, I don't consider you as old, right? That's just to be clear, right? But I was telling a buddy of mine this morning, like there is so much beauty of, hanging out with guys that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, just because they show up in a way where it's like they have nothing to prove. They've been there, they've done that, they know who they are, they have nothing to prove, and they just want to authentically give back.
Yeah.
And man, I think that's such a great way. And even for me at 29, I try to be that. I try to live like I'm 70, 80 years old, show up in a way. And there's so much freedom that comes from that. I know so many people my age that everywhere they show up, they just have to tell people how smart they are, how successful they are, and how amazing they are. And, I see a lot of these guys that are in their 70s and 80s who, man, do they have a lot of things to be prideful about, right? They've accomplished so much in their life, but they just show up in a way where, hey, how can I serve you? I don't need to talk about myself. I have nothing to prove, and I'm just here to do the will of the Father. And I know if I could do that now at 29, man, I think that's going to be a life of freedom, like Paul talks about in Galatians 5.
Yeah. So you dodged my real estate question, which is fine because I got you on a sidetrack. But I know that in your resources, in your story, you have actually thought, man, there are people you live in a big city, you live in a Chicago and, or in a San Francisco, New York, there are people who own bit by bit over the decades, they've built up portfolios of property, not to be YouTubers, but they're pretty anonymous, but they're sitting there. And you can get to know those people, and some of them will want to do seller financing, and you can take over caring for their asset for them and so forth. So that is one way to get up and going, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And for a lot of these older landlords, a lot of times their desire to want to sell it to you actually increases because, there's the financial things the numbers have to work, right? It has to be an absolute win-win. But, one of the things that I always make sure I communicate is, look, like, I understand, I know you've owned this building for 40 years. Like, I know this is your baby. My opportunity and my desire is to carry the torch and continue to do what you've done, which is take great care of it, be an amazing steward, but also take it to the next level, and ensure that this project and this asset is going to be in careful hands, and so that you're right. Those are opportunities that I've been able to culminate for myself.
So one of my takeaways from my chat with you today, Daniel, is get to know an old guy. It'll give you perspective in the generation that you're in. Find out what their story is and what they've learned, what they've been through in life, whether it's through one of the tech waves or whether it's through something else. And somebody called me up about a new app they were developing last year, and they were going on about this. And then I just asked them about a whole bunch of basic stuff like features, functions, things. And this guy says to me, he's like 26 years old and he's the chief product architect. He says to me, how old are you? Where did you learn this stuff? As if it's just been invented. These things just go through cycles. So I love your idea, but I like it from the perspective also of not getting isolated. Otherwise, if you're isolated or insulated in your generation, you can feel lonely and you can lack context. And I recently read something about multi-generational family living, where during COVID, this increased, but more than 50% of households in the US have 3 generations in the building. It's very interesting. And the health that it provides, not just for the old generation, but for the next generations, it causes them to live longer if they're in a multi-generational setting. So I like your idea about the connectedness of generations so that we don't freak out and lose perspective when we see what's going on in the world around us.
Yeah, no, and I think if anything, that's what we miss. Like, I think that's one of the biggest problems that the US has is, the inability for generations to communicate with one another. Like, I think if a lot of 20-somethings and late teens individuals just had one conversation with someone in their 60s and 70s and 80s, they'll realize what the true consequences of something like a democratic socialism or communism really is. And I think if the individual in the 70s were to talk to someone that's my age or younger, I think they'll realize like, wow, okay, so the world is a little different than how we grew up, right? Like you can't necessarily buy a home for 3 times your annual salary anymore, right? Like it's gotten much, it's a little different today, right? So to speak. So
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's such an important thing. And one of the biggest questions that I've asked myself that I think I've been having a lot of conversations with God about is, man, how do we create more community? How do we create more unity? How do we get people to see each other's hearts? And, I think that's such a big thing that we're missing out on.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for sharing some of your story and just taking time to have a chat about these things. It's been great catching up with you and wonderful to see how you're doing. So kwakbrothers.com, people can find you. And and you get into some controversial topics. You get into a variety of different things. You're not afraid to stray off the real estate path. And so I encourage people go listen with an open mind, engage in a conversation, because these are conversations we need to have in these times. So thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Brett, for having me on.